The impossible had already happened 3 times that scorching August afternoon in Silver Lake, Texas. First, when 40 Boeing engineers admitted defeat after 3 weeks of failed attempts. Second, when billionaire Thaddeus Rockford's $250 million private jet remained as silent and stubborn as a mule in the hangar. Third, when 12-year-old Claire Duncan quietly slipped past the security tape with nothing but her mother's worn toolbox and a confident smile that would soon wipe the smirk off the most arrogant man in America. Heat shimmered off the concrete runway at Silver Lake Regional Airport, creating waves that made the distant pine trees dance like mirages. Claire adjusted her grip on the heavy toolbox, its leather handle worn smooth by her mother's calloused hands over 20 years of aircraft maintenance. The metal latches clicked softly as she walked, a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat during countless afternoons spent watching Wendy Duncan work magic on broken engines. "You shouldn't be here, sweetheart." Dale Peterson emerged from the shade of the hangar, his airport maintenance uniform dark with sweat stains. His weathered face creased with concern as he spotted the young girl approaching the restricted area. "This whole section's been cordoned off for weeks now. Nothing but fancy engineers and frustrated billionaires stomping around, making everyone's life miserable." Claire stopped just outside the yellow security tape, her blue eyes scanning the massive hangar beyond. Through the open doors, she could see the sleek white fuselage of Rockford's Gulfstream, its engine cowlings removed to expose the complex machinery within. Men in crisp shirts and khaki pants clustered around laptops and diagnostic equipment, their voices carrying across the space in frustrated murmurs. "I know I shouldn't be here, Mr. Peterson," she said, setting the toolbox down carefully. "But Mom's working a double shift at the commercial terminal, and I was hoping to maybe learn something by watching. She always says the best education comes from seeing real problems get solved." Dale's expression softened. He'd known Claire since she was 6 years old, when Wendy first brought her daughter to work during summer breaks. Even then, the kid had shown an uncanny ability to spot mechanical issues that escaped the notice of seasoned professionals. "That's a mighty expensive problem in there, little miss. Worth more than most folks in Silver Lake will see in 10 lifetimes. Money doesn't make engines any less complicated," Claire replied, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. "Mom always says metal and pistons don't care how much someone paid for them. They either work right or they don't." From inside the hangar came the sound of raised voices. Dr. Gregory Allen, the lead Boeing engineer, was speaking in clipped professional tones to someone on his cellular phone. His team had been working around the clock, running diagnostic after diagnostic, but the Pratt & Whitney engine continued to defy their understanding. 3 weeks of overtime, computer modeling, and increasingly desperate troubleshooting had yielded nothing but mounting frustration and a billionaire client whose patience had evaporated days ago. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Allen was saying into his phone, pacing near the aircraft's port engine. "We've eliminated every possible cause in our manual. The compression readings are perfect. Fuel delivery system is pristine. Ignition timing is precisely calibrated. Yet the engine produces less than 60% power output during climb phase." Claire found herself leaning forward, straining to catch every word. The problem sounded familiar somehow, like an echo of something her mother had encountered before. Wendy had spent 15 years working on commercial aircraft before taking the job at Silver Lake Regional, and she'd brought home stories of mysterious engine anomalies that stumped entire maintenance crews. "The client is threatening to sue Boeing for the full replacement cost of the aircraft," Dr. Allen continued, "plus damages for 3 weeks of delayed business. We're talking about potentially hundreds of millions in liability." Thaddeus Rockford himself appeared from behind the aircraft, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the hangar. At 52, He possessed a kind of aggressive confidence that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the Texas heat, and his expensive polo shirt remained crisp and unwrinkled. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his words treated as gospel. "I don't want to hear about precedents or manuals," he declared, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I want solutions. This aircraft cost me $240 million, and I expect it to function perfectly. I have board meetings in New York, contracts to sign in London, and a merger to finalize in Tokyo. Every day this machine sits broken costs me more money than your entire team makes in a year." Nicole Murphy, a young Boeing engineer fresh out of MIT, looked up from her laptop screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, clearly intimidated by Rockford's presence. "Sir, we've run every possible test. The engine components are functioning within normal parameters individually, but something is causing a power loss during sustained climb operations. It's almost like there's an intermittent restriction somewhere in the system." Rockford's laugh was cold and dismissive. "Almost like? I don't pay for almost like. I pay for certainty, for expertise, for results. If your team can't solve this problem, maybe I need to find engineers who actually understand how aircraft work." Dr. Allen stepped forward, his professional demeanor barely concealing his growing frustration. "Mr. Rockford, with respect, this is an extremely complex system. Sometimes anomalies require time to identify and resolve. We're dealing with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, pressures calculated to precise decimals." "Spare me the technical lecture," Rockford snapped. "I've been told this aircraft represents the pinnacle of engineering excellence. Yet, here it sits, broken, surrounded by supposedly brilliant minds who can't figure out why it won't climb properly. Maybe the problem isn't the machine. Maybe the problem is that I'm stuck in this godforsaken backwater town with mechanics who learned their trade working on crop dusters." The insult hung in the air like exhaust fumes, accurate and poisonous. Several of the Boeing engineers exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing the unfairness of Rockford's attack on the local community, but none of them spoke up. Their jobs depended on keeping this client satisfied, regardless of his behavior. Dale Peterson, however, felt no such constraint. He stepped closer to the security tape, his jaw tightening. "Now just hold on there, mister. The folks in Silver Lake might not have fancy degrees hanging on their walls, but we know aircraft maintenance as well as anyone. Wendy Duncan, who works right here at this airport, has forgotten more about engines than most people ever learn." Rockford turned toward the hangar entrance, his gaze fixing on Dale with the kind of cold assessment usually reserved for insects. "And who exactly are you to speak about aircraft expertise? Let me guess. You change light bulbs and sweep floors. I'm a man who keeps this airport running while you stand around insulting people who've never done you any harm." Dale replied evenly. "And that young lady behind me has spent more time around aircraft than most of your engineers have spent in classrooms." For the first time, Rockford noticed Claire standing outside the security perimeter. His expression shifted from dismissive to genuinely amused, as if he'd just discovered an entertaining joke. "A child? You're suggesting that a child might have insights into a problem that stumped 40 professional engineers?" Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "I'm 12, and I've been learning about aircraft engines since I could hold a wrench. My mom's been teaching me how systems work together, how problems in one area can affect performance in others." Rockford's amusement deepened into something approaching cruelty. "How charming. Tell me, little girl, what do you think is wrong with my $250 million aircraft? Have you diagnosed the problem from behind that security tape?" The mocking tone should have intimidated Claire, should have sent her running back toward the terminal with tears in her eyes. Instead, something crystallized in her mind. A memory of her mother explaining how certain engine problems could hide behind normal-looking diagnostic readings. Wendy had encountered a similar issue years ago on a commercial airliner, a problem that had required looking beyond the obvious symptoms. "I think maybe you've got a partial blockage in your bleed air system," Claire said quietly. "Something small enough that it doesn't show up on ground tests, but big enough to affect climb performance when the engine's working at full capacity." The hangar fell completely silent. Dr. Allen stopped pacing. Nicole Murphy looked up from her computer screen. Even Rockford's smirk faltered slightly as he processed what the child had just suggested. And in that moment of stunned silence, Claire Duncan had no idea that she'd just set in motion a chain of events that would change everything anyone thought they knew about genius, prejudice, and the dangerous power of underestimating a small-town girl with grease under her fingernails. "Bleed air system," Dr. Allen repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "We tested the bleed air valves during our initial diagnostics. All readings were normal. But did you test them under simulated climb conditions?" Claire asked, her confidence growing despite the weight of 40 professional stares focused on her. "My mom says sometimes blockages only show up when the system's under stress, like when the engine's trying to climb and maintain cabin pressure at the same time." Nicole Murphy's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the diagnostic data from 3 weeks of testing. Her eyes widened as she scanned through screens of information. "We tested bleed airflow at ground level with engines at various power settings, but we never simulated the specific pressure differentials that occur during sustained climb operations." Dr. Allen moved closer to Nicole's workstation, studying the data over her shoulder. "If there's a partial obstruction in one of the secondary bleed airlines, it wouldn't necessarily show up in our standard tests. But during climb, when the engine's working harder and the cabin pressurization system is drawing maximum airflow, the restriction would become significant enough to affect overall engine performance." Nicole finished, her voice rising with excitement. "It's so simple, but we never thought to test those specific conditions." Rockford's expression had shifted from amusement to something approaching shock. He looked at Claire as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, rather than simply dismissing her as an irrelevant child. "You're suggesting that a 12-year-old girl has identified a problem that 40 Boeing engineers missed." "I'm suggesting that sometimes fresh eyes see things that experienced eyes overlook," Claire replied. "My mom always says that the simplest explanation is usually the right one, especially when all the complicated explanations don't work." Dr. Allen was already moving toward the aircraft, his professional skepticism warring with genuine curiosity. "It would take about an hour to run the proper tests. We'd need to simulate climb conditions while monitoring bleed air flow rates in real time." "Then do it," Rockford commanded, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. "And if this child is right, if she's identified something that your entire team missed, then I'll want to know how that's possible." As the engineers began preparing their equipment for a new round of testing, Claire felt a mixture of pride and nervousness settling in her stomach. She'd spoken up because the problem had seemed so clear to her, so obvious based on everything her mother had taught her about engines. But now, watching 40 professionals scramble to test her theory, she realized the magnitude of what she'd just done. Dale Peterson placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Your mom is going to be mighty proud when she hears about this, sweetheart. Mighty proud indeed." The diagnostic equipment hummed to life with electronic precision, filling the hangar with the steady rhythm of computerized analysis. Dr. Allen supervised the connection of additional sensors to the Gulfstream's port engine, while Nicole Murphy calibrated pressure monitoring systems that would simulate the exact conditions encountered during sustained climbs to 37. 1,000 feet. Claire watched from beyond the security tape, her toolbox forgotten at her feet, as she absorbed every detail of the professional testing procedure. The Boeing engineers moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing exactly which systems to monitor and how to configure the sophisticated machinery that surrounded Rockford's aircraft like electronic ivy. Initializing cabin pressurization. Simulation, announced Brad Wilson, a senior engineer whose gray beard spoke of decades spent troubleshooting complex mechanical systems. His fingers danced across a tablet interface, adjusting parameters that would trick the aircraft's computers into believing they were climbing through increasingly thin atmosphere. Wendy Duncan appeared in the hangar entrance, her blue maintenance jumpsuit bearing the familiar stains of hydraulic fluid and engine oil. Her shift at the commercial terminal had ended early when a delayed flight canceled its arrival, giving her an unexpected opportunity to check on her daughter. The sight of Claire, standing so close to Rockford's aircraft, sent a jolt of protective concern through her tired mind. Claire Elizabeth Duncan. Wendy's voice carried the particular tone that mothers reserve for children found in places they absolutely should not be. What on earth are you doing here? This is a restricted area, and you know better than to wander around where you don't belong. Dale Peterson intervened before Claire could respond, his expression mixing respect and amazement. Wendy, you need to hear what your daughter just did. She might have solved their engine problem when 40 Boeing engineers couldn't figure it out. Wendy's skeptical expression softened into confusion as she looked between the Dale and the cluster of professionals surrounding the aircraft. What are you talking about? What problem? The billionaire's jet has been producing reduced power during climbs, Dale explained. 3 weeks they've been testing everything under the sun, and Claire suggested it might be a bleed air restriction that only shows up under specific pressure conditions. Dr. Allen approached the group, his professional demeanor noticeably more respectful than it had been an hour earlier. Mrs. Duncan, I assume? Your daughter has proposed a theory that we're about to test. If she's correct, she's identified something that our entire diagnostic protocol missed. Wendy's eyes widened as she processed the implications. She'd brought Claire to the airport countless times over the years, sharing her knowledge of aircraft systems and encouraging her daughter's natural mechanical aptitude. But the idea that 12-year-old Claire had outsmarted a team of Boeing's finest engineers seemed almost impossible to accept. Mom, I just remembered what you told me about that American Airlines flight in Dallas, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. The one where the climb performance was off because of a partial blockage that didn't show up until the cabin pressurization system was working at maximum capacity. The memory clicked into place for Wendy with startling clarity. Flight 777, 7 years ago, when she had been part of the maintenance crew that eventually discovered a microscopic piece of debris in a secondary bleed airline. The problem had taken 2 weeks to identify because it only manifested under very specific operational conditions. Sweet Jesus, Wendy breathed, her hand moving to her daughter's shoulder. You think they might have the same issue? Beginning climb simulation now, Nicole announced from her workstation. Multiple computer screens displayed real-time data streams showing engine performance, bleed airflow rates, and cabin pressurization levels. The Gulfstream's engines responded to the electronic commands, increasing power output while sophisticated sensors monitored every aspect of their operation. Thaddeus Rockford positioned himself near the monitoring station, his earlier arrogance replaced by intense focus. The financial implications of this test were staggering. If the child was right, his aircraft could be returned to service within hours. If she was wrong, he'd wasted another day pursuing a theory suggested by someone young enough to require parental permission for a field trip. Bleed airflow showing normal parameters at simulated 15,000 feet, Brad Wilson reported, his eyes scanning multiple data readouts simultaneously. Cabin pressurization system engaging as programmed. The hangar filled with the subdued roar of engines operating at climbing power, their sound muffled by sophisticated noise-dampening equipment. Claire found herself holding her breath as the test progressed, her confidence in the theory warring with the very real possibility that she'd embarrassed herself in front of people whose expertise dwarfed her own. Limited knowledge. 25,000 feet simulation, Nicole called out, still showing normal flow rates across all bleed air circuits. Dr. Allen frowned at his tablet display, noting that engine performance remained within expected parameters. If Claire's theory was correct, they should be seeing some indication of restriction by this altitude. Perhaps the child's suggestion had been nothing more than an educated guess that happened to sound plausible. 30,000 feet, Rad announced. Cabin pressure differential reaching maximum operational levels. Suddenly, Nicole's computer screen erupted with warning indicators. "I'm showing a significant drop in secondary bleed airflow," she exclaimed, her fingers flying across the keyboard to capture the anomalous readings. "Flow rate has decreased by nearly 30% in the past 60 seconds. Dr. Allen rushed to Nicole's workstation, his eyes widening as he studied the data streaming across her monitor. "There it is," he said, his voice filled with professional amazement. "A restriction that only becomes significant when the system's operating at maximum differential pressure." Wendy squeezed Claire's shoulder, her pride in her daughter's insight, mixing with astonishment at the accuracy of the diagnosis. "How did you know to look there, sweetheart?" "It just made sense," Claire replied, her cheeks flushing with a combination of relief and excitement. "When they said the engine was producing normal power on the ground, but losing performance during climbs, it sounded exactly like what you described with that American Airlines flight." Thaddeus Rockford approached the Duncan family with measured steps, his entire demeanor transformed from the dismissive arrogance he displayed earlier. For a man accustomed to commanding every situation through wealth and influence, the experience of being proven wrong by a 12-year-old girl required significant mental adjustment. "Young lady," he began, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect that surprised everyone within earshot. "It appears you've accomplished something that a team of highly paid professionals could not. How do you explain that?" Claire looked up at the billionaire, no longer intimidated by his imposing presence. "I think sometimes being an outsider helps you see things differently. The engineers were looking at all the complex possibilities, but Mom taught me to start with simple explanations and work up to complicated ones." And as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the hangar in shades of amber and gold, everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that would challenge their assumptions about expertise, intelligence, and the dangerous folly of underestimating a small-town girl who dared to speak up when brilliant minds had fallen silent. "Identifying the restriction location now," Brad Wilson announced from his position near the engine. "Appears to be in the secondary bleed air manifold. Probably a foreign object or debris accumulation that's created a partial obstruction." Dr. Allen was already calculating repair timelines in his head. "If it's accessible through the inspection panels, we could have this resolved within 4 hours. Complete system flush and inspection, replacement of any contaminated components." Rockford's relief was visible as the prospect of getting his aircraft operational again became reality. 3 weeks of delays had cost him several important business opportunities, and the mounting pressure from his board of directors had been increasing daily. But beyond the financial implications, something else was happening in his mind. A grudging recognition that his assumptions about intelligence and expertise might need serious revision. "Mrs. Duncan," he said, turning to Wendy, "your daughter has saved me considerable time and money today. I'd like to express my gratitude in a tangible way." Wendy's expression grew wary. In her experience, Wealthy people's gratitude often came with strings attached, expectations that complicated simple lives. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Rockford." But Claire was just sharing what she'd learned. "We don't expect anything in return." "Nevertheless, I insist," Rockford continued. "Perhaps a scholarship fund for Claire's education. A girl with this kind of analytical ability deserves every opportunity to develop her talents." The offer hung in the air like heat lightning, beautiful and potentially dangerous. Claire looked at her mother, sensing the complex emotions playing across Wendy's weathered features. Pride in her daughter's accomplishment warred with suspicion about the billionaire's motives and concern about accepting charity from someone who'd spent the afternoon insulting their community. "Dale." Peterson cleared his throat diplomatically. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Rockford. Though I'd suggest you might want to start by acknowledging that the folks in Silver Lake aren't quite as backward as you seemed to think earlier." The comment struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Rockford's earlier insults to the local community now seemed not just unkind, but profoundly ignorant. He'd dismissed an entire town's capabilities based on nothing more than geographic prejudice and economic snobbery. "You're absolutely right," he admitted, his voice carrying genuine contrition. "I spoke out of frustration and said things that were both unfair and untrue. The people of Silver Lake have shown more competence in one afternoon than my expensive consultants have demonstrated in 3 weeks." The repair work began with methodical precision. As evening shadows stretched across the hangar floor, Dr. Allen's team had divided into specialized units, each responsible for specific aspects of the bleed air system inspection. The sophisticated diagnostic equipment continued monitoring engine parameters, while mechanics carefully disassembled components to locate the exact source of the restriction. Claire remained at the security perimeter, reluctant to leave despite her mother's gentle suggestions that they head home for dinner. The unfolding repair process fascinated her in ways that textbooks never could, each step revealing new layers of complexity in aircraft systems she'd only read about in technical manuals. Austin Baker jogged into the hangar, his bicycle helmet dangling from one hand and sweat beading on his forehead from the ride across town. At 13, he was Claire's closest friend and frequent partner in mechanical adventures around Silver Lake. Word had spread through the small community that something extraordinary was happening at the airport. "Claire, my dad heard at the hardware store that you figured out what was wrong with some rich guy's airplane," Austin said breathlessly, his excitement palpable. "Is it true? Did you really stump a bunch of engineers?" "I just made a suggestion, based on something Mom taught me," Claire replied, though her eyes sparkled with pride. "They're testing it now to see if I was right." Austin peered through the hangar opening at the cluster of professionals working around the sleek aircraft. "That's incredible. Wait until the kids at school hear about this. You're going to be famous." The prospect of unwanted attention at school made Claire uncomfortable. She'd always preferred working quietly in her mother's garage to being the center of classroom discussions. Fame seemed like a complication she hadn't considered when offering her theory about the engine problem. "We found it," Nicole Murphy called out with excitement in her voice. "There's a small piece of metal debris lodged in the secondary manifold inlet. Looks like it broke off from somewhere else in the system and migrated to this location." Dr. Allen examined the foreign object through a magnifying glass, noting its size and composition. Probably a manufacturing defect that worked loose during normal operations. Small enough to allow partial flow, but positioned perfectly to create the restriction we observed during climb conditions. Thaddeus Rockford moved closer to inspect the debris that had caused 3 weeks of delays and millions of dollars in lost business opportunities. The object was barely larger than a pencil eraser, yet its strategic location had completely mystified his expensive team of experts. "How did you know to look there?" He asked Claire directly, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. What made you think of the bleed air system specifically? Claire glanced at her mother before answering, drawing confidence from Wendy's encouraging nod. Mom told me about a similar problem she encountered years ago. When you described the symptoms, it sounded exactly like what she dealt with. I just remembered her story and thought maybe the same thing was happening here. Father Paul Richards appeared in the hangar entrance, drawn by reports that something significant was happening at the airport. As Silver Lake's Catholic priest, he'd learned to pay attention when his community was involved in unusual events, especially those that might require pastoral guidance or conflict resolution. "Good afternoon, folks," he said, his calm presence immediately noticeable in the charged atmosphere. Dale mentioned there was some excitement down here. I hope everything's working out peacefully. Wendy turned toward the priest, grateful for his familiar presence amid the swirling complexity of the afternoon's events. Father Paul, Claire figured out what was wrong with Mr. Rockford's airplane when all those engineers couldn't solve it. The priest's eyebrows rose as he processed this information. He'd known Claire since her baptism 12 years ago, had watched her grow from a curious toddler into a remarkably bright young girl with an unusual gift for understanding how things worked. But solving problems that stumped professional engineers represented a new level of achievement entirely. "That's quite an accomplishment, Claire," he said warmly. "Your talents continue to amaze me." Nicole Murphy finished documenting the diagnostic findings and approached the group with her laptop displaying the conclusive test results. "The data confirms everything Claire suggested," she announced. "We have a clear restriction in the secondary bleed air system that only manifests under sustained climb conditions." Dr. Allen was already coordinating with his team to begin the repair process. "We'll need to drain the system, remove the affected components, and perform a complete inspection and cleaning. Conservative estimate is 6 hours to completion, assuming we don't encounter any complications." Rockford nodded approvingly, then turned back to Claire with an expression that mixed respect and curiosity. "I have a question for you, young lady. Are you planning to pursue a career in aerospace engineering?" Claire considered the question seriously, aware that her answer might have implications beyond simple curiosity. "I like solving mechanical problems, and I love working with my hands. But I haven't really thought about what I want to be when I grow up." "Perhaps you should," Rockford suggested. "The aerospace industry needs people who can think outside conventional parameters. Your approach today demonstrates exactly the kind of innovative problem-solving that drives technological advancement." Wendy listened to the conversation with mixed feelings. Part of her was enormously proud of Claire's achievement and excited about the possibilities it might represent, but another part worried about encouraging a daughter toward expectations that might overshadow the simple joy she found in understanding how things worked out as the Boeing engineers continued their preparations for the repair work. The small group near the hangar entrance found themselves in an unexpected moment of reflection. The afternoon had challenged assumptions, revealed hidden talents, and forced everyone involved to reconsider their understanding of expertise and intelligence. The Texas sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the airport buildings in shades of amber and gold. In a few hours, Thaddeus Rockford's aircraft would be operational again, ready to carry him back to his world of corporate meetings and financial negotiations. But something fundamental had changed in that hangar, something that would continue to resonate long after the last diagnostic cable was disconnected and the final repair was completed. Claire, Duncan had proven that wisdom could emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that truth was more powerful than prejudice, regardless of age or economic circumstances. The impossible had happened for the 4th time in Silver Lake, and this time, everyone present would be forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that genius doesn't always arrive in the package society expects. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Duncan household before Claire had finished her breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. Denise Coleman, an investigative journalist from the Austin American-Statesman, had driven 2 hours through pre-dawn darkness after receiving a tip about the airport incident from a contact in the aviation industry. She knocked on the front door. With the persistent rhythm of someone accustomed to pursuing reluctant interview subjects, her press credentials and digital recorder were ready, along with a notebook filled with preliminary research about Silver Lake's demographics and economic challenges. Wendy answered the door in her bathrobe, immediately wary of the stranger's professional demeanor and obvious purpose. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Duncan, I'm Denise Coleman from the Austin American-Statesman. I'm hoping to speak with you and your daughter about yesterday's events at the airport. I understand Claire played a significant role in solving a complex engineering problem." The journalist's presence confirmed Wendy's worst fears of the previous day's publicity. She'd hoped that the incident would remain a local story, something the community could handle internally without external interference. "I'm sorry, but we're not interested in talking to reporters," Wendy said firmly, beginning to close the door. "My daughter's just a child, and we prefer to keep our private lives private." Denise placed her hand gently against the doorframe, not blocking it, but indicating her persistence. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Duncan, but this story could inspire other young people to pursue science and engineering careers. Claire's achievement deserves recognition." From the kitchen table, Claire could hear the conversation and felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She'd barely slept the previous night, troubled by dreams of crowds and cameras and people asking questions she couldn't answer. The reality of a reporter at their door made those nightmares seem prophetic. "Mom, I don't want to talk to her," Claire called out, her voice carrying a note of panic that immediately activated Wendy's protective instincts. "You heard my daughter," Wendy said to the journalist. "Please leave our property." Denise reluctantly stepped back from the doorway, but she didn't return to her car immediately. Instead, she called out loudly enough for Claire to hear. "Claire, I just want people to know how amazing you are. You've done something that could help other girls believe in themselves." The emotional manipulation in the reporter's words wasn't lost on Wendy, who had encountered similar tactics during her divorce proceedings years earlier. People who claimed to act in Claire's best interests while pursuing their own agendas. "If you don't leave immediately, I'm calling the sheriff," Wendy warned, her voice hardening with resolve. By 10 o'clock that morning, 3 news vans had arrived in Silver Lake, their crews setting up equipment and preparing for live broadcasts about the girl genius of Silver Lake. The quiet streets of the small town were transformed into something resembling a carnival midway, with reporters interviewing anyone willing to talk. At Silver Lake Elementary School, Principal Janet Foster was already dealing with the first wave of media inquiries about Claire's academic record and extracurricular activities. 3 different news organizations had called before 8 o'clock, seeking information about the girl's performance and any signs of exceptional ability that teachers might have observed. "I'm sorry, but we don't discuss individual students with media representatives," Principal Foster told the latest caller, a television producer from Dallas, who was planning a feature story about gifted children in rural communities. Mrs. Dorothy Kim, Claire's 6th-grade teacher, knocked on the principal's office door with obvious urgency. "Janet, I've had 2 reporters try to corner me in the parking lot this morning. They want to know about Claire's grades, her behavior, whether she's ever shown signs of being a prodigy." The pressure was exactly what Principal Foster had feared when she'd first heard about the airport incident. Public schools had strict policies about protecting student privacy, but those protections could be overwhelmed when media attention reached sufficient intensity. "We need to send a message to all our teachers," Principal Foster decided. No one discusses Claire or any other student with reporters, regardless of how they frame the request. And we should probably call Wendy Duncan to make sure she knows what's happening here. Meanwhile, at the Silver Lake Regional Airport, Sheriff Frank Carter was dealing with his own set of complications. The news crews had been setting up equipment since dawn, transforming the usually quiet facility into a staging area for multiple live broadcasts. Dal Peterson met the sheriff at the airport entrance, his frustration evident as he gestured toward the media circus developing in the parking area. They showed up around 6 this morning, keep asking me to recreate yesterday's events, wanting to know exactly what Claire said and how the engineers reacted. Any of them try to get inside the restricted areas? Frank asked, mentally calculating the additional security measures that might be necessary. Not yet, but they keep pushing the boundaries. That blonde reporter from Channel 8 tried to convince me that the public has a right to know the full story. Frank's experience with media management was limited to traffic accidents and the occasional petty crime, but he understood enough about journalism to recognize when a story was spiraling beyond local control. The arrival of multiple news crews suggested that Claire's achievement was being positioned as a much larger narrative about education, gender equality, and rural American values. I'm going to talk to Judge Wells about getting some kind of protective order, Frank decided. That family didn't ask for this attention, and they shouldn't have to deal with harassment in their own hometown. At Rosie Bennett's diner, the morning coffee crowd buzzed with excited conversation about the previous day's events. Word had spread through Silver Lake's social networks with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve, creating a mixture of pride and protective concern among the locals. Helen Garcia, the diner's owner, wiped down tables while listening to fragments of conversation from various booths. At 63, she'd lived in Silver Lake her entire life and understood better than most how quickly outside attention could disrupt a community's careful equilibrium. I heard that billionaire wants to send Claire to some fancy school, Betty Lou Harris was saying to her companion at the corner table. As the town's unofficial information exchange center, Betty Lou collected and distributed rumors with the efficiency of a social media algorithm. That might not be the blessing it sounds like, replied Eleanor Whitman, Silver Lake's unofficial historian and a retired librarian who understood the value of measured response to dramatic changes. Sometimes opportunities come with prices that aren't immediately obvious. Mickey Campbell entered the diner carrying the morning newspaper, his expression grim as he approached Helen's counter. "You see this?" he asked, spreading the Austin paper's front page for her inspection. The headline read, "12-year-old girl solves aviation mystery that stumped Boeing engineers," accompanied by a stock photo of a private jet and a smaller image of Silver Lake's town square. The article, written by a different reporter who had compiled the story from second-hand sources, contained several factual errors and sensationalized details that made the incident sound more dramatic than it had actually been. "This is exactly what I was worried about," Mickey muttered, scanning the article's content. "They're making it sound like Claire's some kind of miracle child, instead of a smart kid who remembered something her mama taught her." Helen read over his shoulder, her concern growing with each paragraph. The article portrayed Silver Lake as a backward community where Claire's intelligence was unusual and unexpected, reinforcing exactly the kind of stereotypes that residents had been combating for decades. "We need to do something about this before it gets worse," Helen decided. "Maybe call a town meeting or something. Figure out how to protect that family from all this attention." Back at the Duncan house, Wendy had called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, unwilling to leave Claire alone while reporters continued circling their neighborhood like persistent predators. The phone had been ringing constantly until Wendy finally unplugged it from the wall. Claire sat at the kitchen table working on homework, but her concentration was fractured by the periodic appearance of news crews driving slowly past their house. Each time a van stopped outside, she felt her anxiety spike, wondering if this would be the moment when someone ignored her mother's warnings and approached their front door. "Mom, can we go visit Uncle Sam?" Claire asked quietly. "Maybe stay at his house until this all calms down?" Wendy considered the suggestion seriously. Her brother's ranch was 40 miles outside town, far enough from Silver Lake to provide genuine refuge from the media attention. But running away felt like surrendering their right to live peacefully in their own community. "We'll see, sweetheart. Let's give it another day or two and see if things settle down naturally." Austin Baker appeared at their back door, having ridden his bicycle through the alley to avoid the reporters stationed on Elm Street. His usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by obvious concern as Wendy led him into the kitchen. "Claire, it's crazy out there," he said breathlessly. "Mrs. Henderson from Channel 8 tried to get me to talk about what you're like at school. She kept asking if you've always been really smart or if this came out of nowhere." The idea that strangers were questioning her friends about her personality and abilities made Claire feel exposed in ways she'd never experienced before. Her quiet life had been built on the assumption that her private thoughts and capabilities were exactly that, private. "What did you tell her?" Claire asked. "I told her to leave me alone," Austin replied with obvious pride. "My dad says reporters are like vultures, and you shouldn't feed them or they'll keep coming back." Meanwhile, Judge Gloria Wells was convening an emergency session in her chambers, summoning Sheriff Carter, Principal Foster, and Mayor Robert Sullivan to address the escalating media situation. The ornate courthouse office, with its leather-bound law books and mahogany desk, provided a fortress of legal authority against the chaos developing throughout Silver Lake. "This has gone far enough," Judge Wells declared, her voice carrying the accumulated authority of 30 years on the bench. "I will not allow a child in my jurisdiction to be harassed by reporters seeking sensational stories." Mayor Sullivan, a soft-spoken insurance agent who had never expected his largely ceremonial position to involve crisis management, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Gloria, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure we have the legal authority to restrict journalists from public areas. We have the authority to protect the welfare of minors," Judge Wells replied firmly, "and we have the obligation to ensure that our community isn't disrupted by outside interests that have no stake in our long-term well-being." Sheriff Carter consulted his notebook where he documented the morning's escalating incidents. 3 more news crews arrived in the past hour. Channel 12 from Houston, something called Education Weekly, and a freelance documentary filmmaker who claims he's making a movie about gifted children in rural America. The proliferation of media attention had transformed Silver Lake's quiet streets into something resembling a 3-ring circus. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk, creating a cacophony of speculation and misinformation that bore little resemblance to the actual events at the airport. "What about Thaddeus Rockford?" Judge Wells asked. "Has he departed yet?" "His aircraft left about an hour ago," Sheriff Carter confirmed. But before he went, he made a statement to the media trying to downplay Claire's role in solving the problem. Didn't seem to have much effect on their enthusiasm for the story. Through the courthouse windows, they could see reporters setting up equipment on the town square, transforming the peaceful gathering place into a staging area for live broadcasts. The intrusion felt like an invasion to residents who had chosen Silver Lake precisely because it offered refuge from the pace and pressure of larger communities. And as the afternoon sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, casting harsh shadows across the disrupted town, everyone involved began to understand that Claire Duncan's simple act of helpfulness had unleashed forces far beyond anyone's ability to control, forces that threatened to transform a bright young Girl's greatest moment into her most dangerous trial. Victoria Blackwell stepped out of her silver Mercedes at precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon, her designer heels clicking against the courthouse steps with the measured precision of someone accustomed to making dramatic entrances. As Thaddeus's estranged wife, she had learned about the Silver Lake incident through gossip networks that operated faster than any news organization. Her arrival sent ripples of unease through the assembled reporters who recognized her as a potentially explosive source of information about the Rockford family dynamics. Victoria had built a reputation in Dallas social circles for her willingness to discuss private matters when it served her interests. Mrs. Blackwell called Amanda Cross, an investigative journalist who had been tracking the story's corporate connections. "Can you comment on your husband's involvement in yesterday's events? Did he mention the young girl who solved his aircraft problem?" Victoria paused strategically, allowing cameras to focus on her perfectly composed features before responding. "Thaddeus rarely discusses his business failures with me, but I understand he was quite embarrassed by the situation. It must be difficult for a man of his ego to be shown up by a child." The comment was calculated to create exactly the kind of family discord narrative that would keep the story alive for additional news cycles. Victoria's bitter divorce proceedings had been stalled for months over asset disputes, and negative publicity about Thaddeus could provide leverage in their ongoing negotiations. Inside the courthouse, Judge Wells was preparing a temporary restraining order that would establish protective boundaries around the Duncan family and their property. The legal document represented an unusual application of judicial authority, but Gloria Wells had spent 3 decades defending the rights of children in her courtroom. "Sheriff Carter, I want a 50-foot perimeter around the Duncan residence and Claire's school," she instructed while reviewing the restraining order language. "Anyone who violates that boundary can be arrested for criminal trespass and harassment of a minor." The order would not eliminate media coverage entirely, but it would provide the family with breathing space to make decisions about their future without constant surveillance and intrusion. Judge Wells understood that legal solutions could only address symptoms of the problem, not the underlying media appetite for sensational stories. Meanwhile, at Rosie Bennett's diner, an impromptu community meeting was developing as concerned residents gathered to discuss the situation. Helen Garcia had closed the restaurant to outside customers, creating a safe space where locals could coordinate their response to the media invasion. Mickey Campbell stood near the coffee station, his weathered hands gesturing emphatically as he addressed the assembled group. "We need to circle the wagons around that family. Claire did something wonderful, and now these vultures want to pick her apart for entertainment." Father Paul Richards nodded in agreement from his position near the window, where he'd been watching reporters interview passersby on the street. "This is exactly what Jesus warned about when he said to protect the innocent. We have a moral obligation to shield that child from exploitation." Henrietta Rockford entered the diner quietly, her presence causing a momentary hush as residents wondered about her intentions. She'd remained in Silver Lake overnight despite her son's departure, driven by a growing sense of responsibility for the chaos that his presence had inadvertently created. "Mrs. Rockford," Helen Garcia said cautiously, "are you here as Thaddeus's representative, or as someone concerned about Claire's welfare?" "I'm here as a retired teacher who's seen too many bright children damaged by adult expectations and attention they never asked for," Henrietta replied firmly. "My son's involvement in this situation was the catalyst, but now it's up to all of us to protect that little girl from the consequences." Her unexpected alliance with the community surprised several residents who had assumed that wealthy outsiders would automatically support the media attention as beneficial publicity for Silver Lake. Henrietta's perspective as an educator gave her unique credibility in discussions about Claire's well-being. "What do you suggest we do?" asked Carl Martinez, a local mechanic who had worked with Wendy Duncan on several projects over the years. "We stopped cooperating with the media entirely," Henrietta said. "No interviews, no background information, no cute anecdotes about Claire's childhood. We make it clear that this community protects its children, regardless of what outsiders might consider newsworthy." The suggestion resonated with the assembled residents who had been struggling to find an effective response to the persistent reporters. Individual refusals to cooperate had been largely ignored, but a coordinated community-wide silence might force the media to seek stories elsewhere. Dr. Allen called from his hotel room, wanting to express his personal gratitude for Claire's contribution to solving the aircraft problem. When he couldn't reach the Duncan house by phone, he decided to drive there directly. He arrived to find two news vans parked on the street and a reporter attempting to peer through the front windows. The scene triggered his protective instincts. As a father of 3 daughters, all of whom were close to Claire's age. "Excuse me," he said to the reporter, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I think you should leave this family alone." The journalist, a young man from a Dallas television station, turned with obvious annoyance at the interruption. "Sir, this is a public street, and we have First Amendment rights to gather information about matters of public interest." "This is a 12-year-old child's home," Dr. Allen replied firmly, "and your presence here constitutes harassment of a minor. I suggest you find somewhere else to exercise your constitutional rights." The reporter's aggressive response revealed the entitled attitude that had been driving much of the media coverage. Stories about Claire were being treated as commodity content rather than sensitive reporting about a young person's life. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you are, but this kid is news whether you like it or not. She embarrassed a team of Boeing engineers, and people want to know how that happened." Dr. Allen's patience evaporated completely. "I'm Dr. Gregory Allen, the lead engineer on that team. I am telling you that Claire Duncan deserves privacy and respect, not exploitation by people who see her as entertainment." His identification as one of the principals in the original story should have given his words additional weight. But the reporter's reaction suggested that Dr. Allen's perspective was simply another angle to be pursued rather than expert opinion. To be respected. "Dr. Allen, perfect timing. Can you give us an on-camera interview about how it felt to be shown up by a little girl? Our viewers would love to hear your perspective on what went wrong with your team's diagnostic process." The casual cruelty in the reporter's framing of the question crystallized everything that was wrong with the media coverage. Claire's helpful suggestion was being transformed into a narrative of professional embarrassment and generational conflict that bore no resemblance to the actual events. "No comment," Dr. Allen said curtly, turning away from the camera that had appeared in the reporter's hands. Inside the Duncan house, Claire watched through a crack in the living room curtains as Dr. Allen walked to their front door. She'd been hoping to thank him for treating her suggestions seriously and for defending her family's privacy against the persistent reporters. Wendy answered the door cautiously, recognizing Dr. Allen from the previous day's events at the airport. His presence on their doorstep could mean additional complications or potential support. She couldn't determine which from his expression. "Mrs. Duncan, I wanted to personally thank Claire for her insight into our engine problem," he said quietly. "But more importantly, I wanted you to know that Boeing will not participate in any media coverage that exploits your daughter's contribution." The assurance provided some relief to Wendy's growing anxiety about corporate interests aligning with journalistic sensationalism. Dr. Allen's professional credibility could potentially influence other media coverage if he was willing to advocate for Claire's privacy. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" Wendy asked. "I think Claire would appreciate hearing that from you directly." As Dr. Allen entered their modest home, the contrast between his corporate background and the Duncan family's simple lifestyle became immediately apparent. But rather than creating social awkwardness, The difference seemed to reinforce his respect for Claire's achievement under circumstances far removed from the privileged environment that typically produced engineering prodigies. "Claire," he said as she emerged from the living room, "I want you to know that what you did yesterday was remarkable. Not because it embarrassed my team, but because it demonstrated the kind of creative thinking that makes engineering progress possible." Claire looked up at him with genuine curiosity. "Were you really embarrassed? I didn't mean to make anyone look bad." "Not embarrassed, impressed," Dr. Allen replied. "Good engineers learn from everyone, regardless of age or experience. You taught us something valuable about keeping open minds when conventional approaches fail." As afternoon shadows began lengthening across Silver Lake, the community's protective response was taking shape. Judge Wells's restraining order would soon provide legal protection. The diner meeting had produced a coordinated strategy for media non-cooperation, and allies like Dr. Allen were emerging to support the Duncan family. But the real test was yet to come. The next 24 hours would determine whether a small Texas town could successfully protect one of its children from the unintended consequences of her own brilliance, or whether outside forces would prove too powerful for local resistance. To overcome, Sheriff Frank Carter arrived at the Duncan residence at exactly 4 o'clock that afternoon, carrying copies of Judge Wells's temporary restraining order and wearing the determined expression of a man prepared to enforce the law regardless of media complaints. His 20-year career in law enforcement had taught him that protecting children sometimes required taking unpopular stands against powerful interests. The news crews clustered on Elm Street watched nervously as the sheriff approached their staging area, cameras ready to capture what they assumed would be a routine confrontation between local law enforcement and constitutional journalism. They had no idea they were about to encounter something unprecedented in their experience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sheriff Carter announced, his voice carrying across the street with unmistakable authority, "you now have legal notice that approaching within 50 feet of this residence constitutes criminal trespass. The same restriction applies to Silver Lake Elementary School during school hours." He personally served copies of the restraining order to each news crew, ensuring that no reporter could later claim ignorance of the legal boundaries. The document represented Judge Wells's innovative application of child protection statutes to create a buffer zone around Claire's normal life. "Sheriff, this is a clear violation of First Amendment rights," protested Amanda Cross, the investigative journalist who had been leading the media charge. "We have every right to report on matters of public interest." "You have the right to report," Sheriff Carter replied evenly, "but you don't have the right to harass a 12-year-old girl in her own neighborhood. The restraining order allows you to cover the story from public areas beyond the 50-foot perimeter." The legal intervention provided immediate relief to the Duncan family, though it also ensured that the story would continue developing in courtrooms and legal filings rather than simply fading from public attention. Victoria Blackwell's inflammatory comments had already generated additional interest from tabloid publications that specialized in family conflict narratives. Inside the house, Claire felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she watched the news vans reluctantly relocate to positions down the street. The physical distance restored some sense of safety to their home, even though cameras remained pointed in their direction. "Does this mean they can't bother us anymore?" she asked her mother, pressing her face against the living room window to observe the reporters' frustrated expressions. "It means they have to keep their distance," Wendy replied carefully. "But sweetheart, I think we need to talk about what happens next. This attention isn't going to disappear just because we want it to." The conversation they'd been avoiding could no longer be postponed. Claire's moment of brilliance had created a permanent change in their lives, and they needed to develop strategies for managing the long-term consequences. At the Silver Lake Community Center, Father Paul Richards was addressing an overflow crowd of residents who had gathered for an emergency town meeting. The Gothic Revival building, constructed in 1923 with local limestone, had hosted countless community discussions over the decades, but never one quite like this. We're here tonight because one of our children accomplished something extraordinary, Father Paul began, his voice carrying the moral authority that had guided Silver Lake through previous crises. But we're also here because that accomplishment has attracted attention that threatens to harm the very child we should be celebrating. The assembled crowd included virtually every family in Silver Lake, united by shared concern for Claire's welfare and growing anger about the media invasion of their community. Mickey Campbell sat in the front row, his weathered face reflecting decades of protective instincts toward local children. Helen Garcia occupied a chair near the center aisle, her notebook open as she prepared to document the meeting's decisions. The question before us, Father Paul continued, is how we protect Claire Duncan while still honoring her remarkable achievement. How do we celebrate one of our own without sacrificing her childhood to outside interests? Henrietta Rockford rose from her seat near the back of the room, her presence causing a brief murmur among residents who were still processing her unexpected alliance with their community. If I may speak, she said, her voice carrying the classroom authority that had commanded respect for 4 decades of teaching. I've seen what happens when bright children become public commodities. The attention destroys their natural curiosity and turns learning into performance. We cannot allow that to happen to Claire. Her words resonated with parents throughout the room who understood intuitively that childhood was a fragile thing, easily damaged by adult ambitions and external pressures. Austin Baker's father, Tom, stood to address the crowd. My boy told me that Claire doesn't want to be famous. She just wanted to help solve a problem. Maybe we should listen to what the child actually wants instead of what everyone else thinks is best for her. The observation cut to the heart of the ethical dilemma facing Silver Lake. Adults were making decisions about Claire's future based on their own assumptions about opportunity and recognition, without adequately considering her own preferences and comfort level. What are you proposing? Asked Principal Foster, who had been struggling with media requests all day. Complete information blackout, Tom Baker replied. No interviews, no school records, no childhood stories. Nothing that feeds the publicity machine. We make it boring for them to stay here. The strategy represented a coordinated application of the non-cooperation approach that Henrietta had suggested earlier. If Silver Lake could present a united front of silence, the media attention might shift to more accessible stories elsewhere. Judge Wells entered the community center during the discussion, her judicial robes adding formal authority to the gathering. Her presence indicated that legal protections were only part of a larger community response to the crisis. The restraining order provides immediate protection, she announced to the crowd, but long-term solutions require community commitment. Legal documents are only as effective as the people willing to enforce them. Dr. Allen appeared at the back of the room, having driven directly from the airport after completing his final inspection of the repaired aircraft. His presence surprised many residents who hadn't expected ongoing involvement from the Boeing team. I wanted you to know, he said, addressing the crowd from the center aisle, that Boeing Corporation will not participate in any media coverage. That exploits Claire's contribution. We've instructed our public relations department to decline all interview requests related to this incident. The corporate commitment represented significant support for Silver Lake's protective strategy. If Boeing refused to provide technical details or engineer interviews, much of the story's journalistic appeal would be eliminated. Margaret Thompson, the town librarian, raised her hand to speak. What about education opportunities? That billionaire mentioned scholarships and special programs. Are we protecting Claire from good things along with the bad things? The question highlighted the complex balance between protection and opportunity that the community was trying to navigate. Educational advantages could benefit Claire's future, but they also carried risks of premature specialization and inappropriate pressure. Any legitimate educational opportunity will still be available 6 months from now, Henrietta replied. Childhood only happens once. There's no urgency to make permanent decisions based on temporary fame. As the meeting continued past 8 o'clock, consensus emerged around a comprehensive strategy for protecting Claire while preserving her future options. The plan combined legal protection, media non-cooperation, and educational patience to create a protective cocoon around the Duncan family. But implementation would require sustained commitment from every resident of Silver Lake. The community was about to discover whether small-town solidarity could withstand the pressures of national media attention and corporate interests. Meanwhile, 200 miles away in Dallas, Thaddeus Rockford was reviewing newspaper clippings about the Silver Lake incident with growing discomfort. His public relations team had compiled a comprehensive media analysis, showing how the story was being portrayed across different platforms. The coverage uniformly presented him as an arrogant billionaire humbled by a small-town girl. A narrative that was accurate but uncomfortable in its implications for his corporate image. More troubling was the realization that his own behavior had created the circumstances that now threatened Claire's privacy and well-being. He reached for his phone and dialed his mother's number, knowing that Henrietta remained in Silver Lake, and understanding for the first time that her presence there wasn't coincidental. "Mother," he said when she answered, "I've been reading about what's happening in Silver Lake. I think I need to do something to help fix this situation. What did you have in mind?" Henrietta asked, her tone suggesting that she'd been expecting this call. "I'm not sure yet. But that little girl helped me solve a problem, and now I've created a much bigger problem for her. There has to be something I can do to make this right." The conversation would continue late into the evening as mother and son worked together to develop a plan that might redirect the media narrative away from Claire Duncan and toward more appropriate targets. But success would require Thaddeus to make personal sacrifices that would test whether his transformation from arrogant billionaire to concerned citizen was genuine or merely temporary. Thaddeus Rockford's silver rental car pulled into Silver Lake at dawn on the third day, carrying no corporate logos or expensive accessories that might attract attention. His designer suits had been replaced by simple khakis and a polo shirt, while his usual entourage of assistants and security personnel had been left behind in Dallas. The transformation was deliberate and complete. He'd spent 2 sleepless nights developing a strategy to redirect media attention away from Claire Duncan and toward himself, understanding that his own reputation would be the necessary sacrifice to protect the 12-year-old girl from consequences she'd never deserved. His first stop was the courthouse, where Judge Wells was reviewing additional motions filed by media organizations challenging the restraining order. The legal battle was escalating beyond local jurisdiction, with First Amendment lawyers arguing that child protection statutes couldn't be used to restrict legitimate journalism. "Your Honor," Thaddeus said as he entered Judge Wells's chambers, "I'm here to request a meeting with the media representatives. I believe I can resolve this situation in a way that serves everyone's interests." Judge Wells studied the billionaire carefully, noting the obvious changes in his appearance and demeanor since their last encounter. "Mr. Rockford, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure additional publicity is what the Duncan family needs right now." "I'm not here to create more publicity," Thaddeus replied. "I'm here to redirect it. The media wants a story about my aircraft problem. I'm prepared to give them that story, but on terms that protect Claire's privacy." His proposal intrigued Judge Wells, who understood that legal solutions alone couldn't eliminate the media's appetite for sensational content. If Thaddeus could provide alternative material that satisfied journalistic requirements while protecting Claire, the strategy might succeed where restraining orders would ultimately fail. What exactly do you have in mind? A press conference, where I take full responsibility for the diagnostic failures that led to 3 weeks of delays. I'll discuss my own arrogance and prejudices, my unfair treatment of the Silver Lake community, and the business lessons I've learned from this experience, all without mentioning Claire by name. The plan represented a sophisticated understanding of how media narratives could be shaped and redirected. By positioning himself as the central figure in a story about corporate humility and personal growth, Thaddeus could satisfy the journalist's need for compelling content while removing Claire from the spotlight at the Duncan house. Wendy was preparing Claire for another day of modified house arrest, helping her organize schoolwork that teachers were providing through private delivery to avoid media contact at the school building. The isolation was becoming increasingly difficult for a 12-year-old who thrived on social interaction and outdoor activities. "Mom, how long do we have to stay hidden like this?" Claire asked, looking longingly toward the backyard where her bicycle sat unused beneath the oak tree. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we'll figure something out. Your safety and privacy are more important than anything else." The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the back door. Wendy peered through the curtains to see Henrietta Rockford standing on their small porch, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the patient expression of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary. "Mrs. Rockford," Wendy said as she opened the door cautiously. "Is everything all right?" "I hope it will be," Henrietta replied. "My son is here in Silver Lake, and he has a plan to help resolve this situation. I wanted to discuss it with you before he proceeds." Claire appeared beside her mother, curious about the elderly woman who had become an unexpected ally during the crisis. "Is Mr. Rockford going to make the reporters go away?" "He's going to try, dear," Henrietta said gently. "But first, we need to make sure you and your mother are comfortable with his approach." The family conference that followed would prove crucial to determining whether Thaddeus's redemption plan could succeed without creating additional complications for the Duncan family. Meanwhile, at the Silver Lake Regional Airport, Dr. Allen was conducting a final equipment inspection while coordinating with Boeing's corporate communications department about their response to ongoing media inquiries. The company had maintained its commitment to avoiding coverage that exploited Claire, but pressure was mounting from aviation industry publications that wanted technical details about the diagnostic breakthrough. Dr. Allen called Nicole Murphy as she approached with her laptop, displaying the latest media analysis. "The story is starting to shift toward questions about our diagnostic procedures. Some publications are suggesting that Boeing's standard protocols might be inadequate." The development represented exactly the kind of corporate liability issue that could transform Claire's helpful observation into a major scandal affecting Boeing's reputation and financial standing. If the company was perceived as incompetent rather than simply unlucky, the consequences could extend far beyond one billionaire's aircraft problem. "What's the company's position?" Dr. Allen asked, understanding that corporate interests might soon conflict with his personal commitment to protecting Claire's privacy. "Legal department wants a complete review of our diagnostic protocols, and public relations is pushing for interviews that demonstrate our technical competence. They're arguing that company reputation takes precedence over individual privacy concerns." The corporate pressure represented a new threat to the protective strategy that Silver Lake had developed. If Boeing decided that defending their business interests required detailed discussion of Claire's contribution, the community's information blackout could be overwhelmed by corporate disclosure requirements. At the community center, Father Paul Richards was meeting with a delegation of parents who were growing concerned about the long-term impact of the media siege on their children's education and emotional well-being. Silver Lake Elementary had been operating under modified procedures, for 3 days, with increased security and restricted access that was disrupting normal classroom activities. "Father, we appreciate the community's support for the Duncan family," said Maria Santos, whose daughter was in Claire's 6th grade class. "But our children are also suffering from this situation. They're scared to walk to school, confused about why there are cameras everywhere, and falling behind in their studies because of the disruptions." The concern was legitimate and reflected a growing tension between protecting Claire and maintaining normal life for other families in Silver Lake. The media attention was creating collateral damage that threatened the community's ability to sustain its protective response. "What are you suggesting?" Father Paul asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Maybe it's time to consider whether the Duncan family would be better served by leaving Silver Lake temporarily," Maria continued. "If they went to stay with relatives somewhere else, the media would follow them, and our children could return to normal school schedules." The suggestion represented a fundamental shift in community strategy, from collective protection to voluntary exile. While it might resolve the immediate crisis, it would also establish a precedent that outside pressure could force local families to abandon their homes and communities. "I understand the frustration," Father Paul replied carefully, "but sending the Duncans away would send the wrong message about our values. We don't sacrifice community members to make problems easier to manage." The meeting continued for 2 hours, with parents expressing legitimate concerns about the broader impact of the crisis, while community leaders struggled to maintain unity around the protective strategy. The debate was interrupted by Austin Baker's arrival with urgent news from the town square. "Father Paul, there's a bunch of new reporters setting up equipment near the courthouse. Someone said Mr. Rockford is back and planning to hold a press conference." The announcement sent ripples of concern through the assembled parents. Thaddeus's return could represent additional complications or potential solutions, but his track record suggested that his interventions often created unintended consequences. For local residents, "When is this press conference supposed to happen?" Father Paul asked. "In about an hour," Austin replied. "And Sheriff Carter said to tell you that Claire's mom wants to meet with community leaders before it starts. She's at the courthouse now." The emergency gathering at Judge Wells's chambers would determine whether Silver Lake's protective strategy could survive another unpredictable intervention by the billionaire whose aircraft problem had started the entire crisis. As community leaders hurried toward the courthouse, none of them could predict that the next hour would bring either the resolution they desperately needed or the final collapse of their efforts to shield Claire Duncan from the dangerous consequences of her own brilliance. The battle for Claire's childhood was approaching its climax, and the outcome would depend on whether a reformed billionaire could successfully sacrifice his own reputation to protect a small-town girl who had never asked to become the center of a national debate about genius, privilege, and the price of unwanted fame. The courthouse conference room had never hosted a gathering quite like the one that convened at 11 o'clock that morning. Judge Wells presided over a table surrounded by an unlikely alliance: Wendy and Claire Duncan, Thaddeus and Henrietta Rockford, Father Paul Richards, Sheriff Carter, Dr. Allen, and Mayor Sullivan. Claire sat quietly beside her mother, overwhelmed by the gravity of adult discussions about her future, but determined to have her voice heard in decisions that would affect her life. At 12 years old, she possessed a wisdom beyond her years about the difference between helpful recognition and harmful exploitation. "Before we proceed with any press conference," Judge Wells began, "I want to ensure that everyone understands the stakes involved. Media attention rarely disappears completely once it's been generated. Any strategy we implement today will have long-term consequences for the Duncan family." Thaddeus leaned forward in his chair, his expression carrying the weight of genuine remorse and determination. "Your Honor, I take full responsibility for creating this situation. My behavior when I arrived in Silver Lake was inexcusable, and my presence attracted media attention that has disrupted this community and threatened Claire's privacy. He turned toward Claire directly, his voice softening with respect that had been completely absent during their first encounter. Claire, I want you to know that I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to fix the problems I've caused. But I need to know what you want to happen. Claire looked around the table at all the concerned adult faces, then spoke with the clarity that had characterized her aircraft diagnosis 3 days earlier. I just want to go back to being a normal kid. I want to ride my bike to school, work on engines with my mom, and hang out with Austin without people taking pictures of me. Her simple statement cut through the complex legal and media considerations that had dominated adult discussions for 3 days. Claire Duncan wanted exactly what every 12-year-old deserved: the freedom to be herself without constant scrutiny or adult expectations about her future. That's what we're going to make happen, Thaddeus said firmly. Here's what I'm proposing. I hold a press conference where I discuss my own failures, my arrogance, my prejudices against rural communities, and the business lessons I've learned from this experience. I position myself as the central figure in a story about corporate humility and personal growth. Dr. Allen nodded approvingly. Boeing will support that narrative. We can discuss our diagnostic procedures and lessons learned without mentioning Claire specifically. The technical aspects of the solution become secondary to the human story of prejudice and redemption. But will that actually work? Wendy asked, her maternal skepticism evident. Won't reporters just keep asking about Claire anyway? Henrietta spoke up with the authority of someone who understood both media dynamics and child psychology. The key is giving them a better story. Thaddeus's transformation from arrogant billionaire to humble business leader is actually more compelling than a simple tale about a smart child. Adults like stories that confirm their assumptions about wealth and power. Sheriff Carter consulted his notes about the media situation. We've got 17 news crews in town now, plus freelance journalists and documentary filmmakers. This press conference could either satisfy their appetite or make them more hungry for additional content. There's something else, Thaddeus continued. I'm prepared to make a significant financial commitment to Silver Lake's educational programs. Not as a reward for Claire, but as an apology to the community I insulted. A scholarship fund, technology upgrades for the school, support for the airport's maintenance training programs. The offer represented exactly the kind of constructive outcome that could emerge from crisis if handled properly. Instead of exploiting Claire's achievement for publicity purposes, Thaddeus was proposing to channel his resources towards systematic improvements that would benefit the entire community. Claire listened to the discussion with growing understanding that the solution involved making her contribution less special rather than more celebrated. By embedding her insight within a larger narrative about community wisdom and corporate learning, the adults were trying to protect her from individual attention while preserving the value of what she'd accomplished. Mr. Rockford, she said quietly, if you do this press conference, will you promise not to talk about me being smart or special? I just want to be Claire Duncan from Silver Lake, not some kind of genius girl. I promise, Thaddeus replied solemnly. In fact, I'm going to suggest that the real genius belongs to your mother and the other maintenance professionals who created the learning environment that made your observation possible. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of positioning Claire as an exceptional individual, Thaddeus would present her insight as the natural result of Silver Lake's educational culture and community. Knowledge-sharing traditions. Wendy felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that Thaddeus was prepared to sacrifice his own corporate image to protect her daughter. Why are you willing to do this? You barely know us. Because Claire taught me something more important than aircraft maintenance, Thaddeus replied. She taught me about humility, respect, and the wisdom that can emerge from the most unexpected places. I've spent my entire adult life thinking that money and position made me superior to everyone else. A 12-year-old girl showed me how wrong I was. At 12:30 that afternoon, Thaddeus Rockford stood behind a makeshift podium on the courthouse steps, facing the largest gathering of media representatives that Silver Lake had ever seen. His prepared statement had been carefully crafted to redirect attention away from Claire while providing compelling content about corporate responsibility and personal transformation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the town square with surprising humility, "I'm here today to discuss a profound lesson in corporate arrogance and the price of prejudice that I learned this week in Silver Lake, Texas." The opening immediately captured media attention by positioning Thaddeus as the central figure in a story about billionaire humbling rather than child genius. Every word had been chosen to minimize Claire's role while maximizing the dramatic narrative of his own transformation. 3 weeks ago, my aircraft developed a mechanical problem that stumped a team of 40 professional engineers. Instead of approaching this challenge with appropriate respect for local expertise, I arrived in Silver Lake with assumptions and prejudices that were both unfair and ignorant. He paused strategically, allowing cameras to capture his expression of genuine remorse. I insulted this community's capabilities based on nothing more than geographic snobbery and economic prejudice. I dismissed the knowledge and experience of maintenance professionals who had forgotten more about aircraft systems than I would ever learn. The crowd of reporters leaned forward, recognizing that Thaddeus was providing exactly the kind of personal confession that made for compelling content. His willingness to acknowledge specific failures was unprecedented for a corporate leader of his stature. The solution to our aircraft problem came not from expensive consultants or sophisticated diagnostics, but from the practical wisdom that exists in communities like Silver Lake. Local knowledge, passed down through generations of skilled professionals, identified an issue that our formal procedures had missed. The brilliant aspect of his presentation was the way it celebrated Silver Lake's expertise without mentioning Claire by name. He was positioning the entire community as the source of the diagnostic breakthrough, making any individual child irrelevant to the larger story. I'm here today to announce a $5 million commitment to Silver Lake's educational and training programs. Thaddeus continued, not as payment for solving my aircraft problem, but as an apology for my disrespectful behavior toward people who deserved better treatment. The financial commitment created a new angle for media coverage that shifted focus toward corporate philanthropy and community development. Questions about Claire became secondary to discussions about economic impact and educational investment. From the courthouse window, Claire watched the press conference with her mother and the other community leaders, marveling at how skillfully Thaddeus was redirecting attention away from her personal story toward broader themes of respect and learning. "Is it working?" she asked Judge Wells, who had been monitoring reporters' reactions through her courthouse observations. "I think so, sweetheart. Look at how they're writing in their notebooks. They're more interested in the money and the business story than in talking about a 12-year-old girl." The strategy succeeded beyond everyone's expectations. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, half the news crews had departed Silver Lake to cover other stories, satisfied with content about corporate transformation and community investment. The remaining journalists focused their coverage on Thaddeus's business practices and philanthropic commitments rather than pursuing additional details about Claire's contribution. Dr. Allen held his own brief press conference an hour later, discussing Boeing's diagnostic procedures and lessons learned without mentioning Claire specifically. His presentation positioned the aircraft problem as an opportunity for industry-wide improvement in maintenance protocols rather than a failure of professional competence. Stopped by evening, the media siege of Silver Lake had effectively ended. The combination of legal protection, community non-cooperation, and strategic redirection had successfully shielded Claire from exploitation while preserving the positive aspects of her achievement. 6 months later, Claire Duncan stood in her mother's workshop on a crisp October morning, carefully adjusting the carburetor on a local farmer's crop-dusting aircraft. The engine repair required exactly the kind of systematic problem-solving that had become her trademark approach to mechanical puzzles. The Thaddeus Rockford Scholarship Fund had quietly provided educational opportunities for 12 local students, including Austin Baker, who was now studying engineering at the community college while living at home. The fund operated without publicity or recognition ceremonies. Exactly as Claire had requested, Claire had returned to her normal life at Silver Lake Elementary, where teachers and classmates treated her achievement as a source of quiet pride rather than celebrity status. She continued learning about aircraft systems from her mother, while maintaining the academic performance that had always characterized her school experience. The aircraft incident had become local legend, but it was told as a story about community, knowledge, and the importance of respecting diverse sources of wisdom rather than a tale about individual genius. Silver Lake had successfully protected one of its children while preserving the positive lessons that emerged from crisis. On this particular October morning, as Claire tightened the final bolt on the carburetor assembly, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from solving problems through patient application of knowledge and skill. The mechanical work connected her to generations of craftspeople who had learned their trades through mentorship and practice rather than formal recognition. Thaddeus Rockford had kept his promises to the community, providing educational support without seeking publicity or control over how resources were used. His transformation from arrogant billionaire to respectful benefactor had become complete. Though he rarely visited Silver Lake to avoid drawing attention to his ongoing involvement. Wendy Duncan watched her daughter work with the same quiet pride that had characterized their relationship before the media attention. Claire remained the same curious, compassionate young woman she had always been, unharmed by fame and undaunted by the brief encounter with forces beyond their small-town experience. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Wendy asked as Claire completed the carburetor installation. "Just wondering if we solved that problem the right way," Claire replied, referring not to the carburetor but to the larger challenge of protecting her privacy while honoring her achievement. "I think we did," Wendy said, putting her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "You helped solve an aircraft problem. The community learned to protect its children, and everyone involved became a little wiser about what really matters in life." As the Texas sun climbed toward its afternoon peak, painting the airport hangar in warm golden light, Claire Duncan continued the quiet work that had always brought her the greatest satisfaction. She had touched the larger world briefly, solved a problem that mattered, and returned safely to the community that valued her for who she was rather than what she might become. The story of the girl who fixed a billionaire's jet had ended not with fame or fortune, but with the perfect resolution that Silver Lake had fought so hard to achieve: a normal childhood preserved, a community strengthened, and a young woman free to discover her own path without the burden of other people's expectations about her extraordinary mind. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life stories. Community, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.